Good evening. You're watching The Digital Age, and I'm James Goodale. You know, there's a great question as to who has the blame for the intelligence failure we've had in Iraq. Should we blame the politicians for exaggerating all the facts? Should we blame the CIA for having the facts wrong? Tonight, we're going to focus on the second. We don't want to eliminate the first. We want to focus on the CIA, and particularly we want to focus on a speech that George Tenet gave at Georgetown University recently, in which he set forth, I would say, his defense of what the CIA did. So the issue tonight is, did Tenet have it right? And joining us tonight is Bob Jervis, who is the Adlai Stevenson Professor of Political Science at Columbia University, a one-time president of the American Political Science Association, an extremely important job. And you also have another important job where you were chairman of the DCI Historical Review Panel, and you have the highest security clearance there is to do that, in which you advise the government how to declassify documents. And you have long experience in issues of national security. So let's just talk, if we can, generally about what Tenet's speech was. I'm clogging the airways. If you want to start, you can, but let me just throw a few things out. Generally, it seems to me in this speech, Tenet's faced with the fact that we couldn't find the chemical weapons. Yeah. And so he's got to tell the nation, you know, where do we come from in the CIA? And to make a long story short, he said, look, we can't find the chemical weapons. We can't find the vials of anthrax. We can't find the nuclear program. And by the way, there was a missile program out there. But with respect to the first three topics, what he says in a nutshell, I think, so let me see what you think is, no, we didn't find them. But I want you to be very clear, there was an intent to have these programs. And then secondly, I think what he says is we need more time. With respect to the weapons, that's something else, we can get to it. The missiles, I should say, we can get that in a moment. But why don't we start with the chemical? Because that's what everyone thinks about. Gee, they said they were going to have these big piles, they didn't find them. What is your view of Tenet's approach to, let's say, the chemical weapons?
Well, let me back off just a little on the speech itself.
Yeah, please.
I was disappointed, really. I didn't think it was, I thought he was defensive. His tone was defensive, and he was also defensive in the sense that I think he was defending positions that are not defensible anymore. It was not, so to speak, coming as clean as he could have, being as blunt about the failures, and discussing why they occurred, which are many reasons. The chemicals, in a way, are the clearest case because everyone, I think, expected not only capability, but stockpiles. And of course, maybe we will yet find something, but that really looks unlikely. And this is a bad failure, and all the others are bad failures too. And part of it are for reasons that Tenet alludes to but doesn't discuss. It's a very, very hard job. I mean, we're trying to find things that people are trying to hide from us, and partly also we're trying to understand people who are hard to understand. In this case, it was bizarre. We thought we were trying to find stuff that was hidden. In fact, they were somewhat bluffing. They were denying they had it, but really leading us to believe they had it, when this didn't make any sense to us at all.
Does it, by the way, make any sense to you today?
A little. If you want, we can, I mean, well, we're not sure. Yeah, let's
just diverge a little bit.
First,
I'm interested in your...
Well, because this is, I think, it's always the biggest puzzle, and we've lost sight of it. I mean, what Saddam didn't make sense to us. And you know why? Because it didn't make sense. I mean, he was committing political and perhaps physical suicide. He didn't have the darn stuff. He could have taken actions to show us he didn't have it. On this point, the administration is right. He could do what Libya did, what other countries did. He really could have provided evidence that would have convinced certainly the West Europeans and maybe even convinced the US government. And when a failure to do this was going to mean, say, certain political death and maybe physical death. So if you were a CIA analyst at the time, or George Tenet, and you were to say, maybe he doesn't have this stuff, but is bluffing us, you know, someone would have said, well, what are you smoking? And Why did he do it? Well, we're really not sure.
Yeah.
But there's some, I think one main reason is we being the Bush administration, convinced Saddam that we were going to get him unless he complied. Okay, that's part of the thing. You try to make your threats credible. But if you're trying to influence him, you have to make the promises credible. You have to make the credible promise to Saddam that if he complies, if he disarms, then we'll leave him in power, or else he doesn't have any incentive to do anything. We didn't make that promise credible. And after all, the Bush administration's position in most of the run-up was regime change.
Then they changed it, didn't they? Yeah.
That's right. They changed it to compliance for political reasons. If you were Saddam, would you have believed that? I don't think so. I didn't half believe it. But that puts the CIA in an awfully difficult position. So I think, in a sense, what annoys me about Tenet's speech, and I do report to him, I know him some, I admire him.
You report to him?
Yes, we do.
Oh, interesting.
Although I haven't seen him much since 9/11.
Really? Well, do you see him often?
We did before 9/11. We saw him twice a year. We personally reported to him. And so
you're going to pick on your boss a little bit?
I can't say I know him very well, but I've seen him for several hours.
Yeah.
I find him very candid. He likes discussion, very open, doesn't mind being told when you think he's wrong. He'll tell you when he thinks you're wrong. So I was disappointed, partly because I think he had more of a, I don't want to say, something between an excuse and a reason. And I think the American people need to understand how hard the game is and how difficult this situation was. And I think the way you do that first is being a little more forthcoming on where the errors were, and then pointing out
well, even
problems.
on the chemical weapons, there was going to be a pile, and then I think there was also an allegation that they had hidden factories in order to produce them. Now, those are the two facts, I think. The facts get a little complicated. When Tenet comes to dealing with those two facts, he doesn't even deal with the second one. And then he says on the first one, and I want to ask you again, though, a little bit on the first one. He says we're only 85% through our inspection. And so give us some more time. What do you think of that argument?
I mean, like a student who wants another couple of hours on the exam. Enough is enough. I mean, yes, it is possible, and it's important, especially for my tone, which may be a little too flip, to realize we can be wrong about anything.
We can still be wrong.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We can't be in the position the CIA was in. We've got to have someone who...
We could pick up the newspaper tomorrow and find a lot of stuff we didn't know, but it's very, very unlikely.
Well, it's interesting, that here we're sort of agreeing with each other, but we admit there's a chance, but we really don't admit it. We're not dissenting. We're not dissenting from the general view. It's hard to dissent from the general view. You're in the academy. That's the place where dissent is supposed to be heard. Do you think there is something wrong with the CIA that it doesn't foster a culture of dissent from the given picture?
That's a very important and hard question to answer without being really in the organization more than I am. I did a post-mortem 25 years ago on why this analyst in CIA was slow to see that the Shah would fall. And at that point, I was able to get, not a full insider, you can't know an organization until you live in it, but I was interviewing people daily and reading a lot. I've been living out there. And I think it is true, not that they're more conformist than anyone else, certainly not more conformist than most professors, but they're no less conformist.
Are the professors conform? I mean, I think of the
we don't want to get into that. Yes.
You don't want to get in trouble with it?
Well, it's a combination.
But you don't want to get in trouble with your peers. So it's the same thing. In fact, professor's life is not that different in a sense than someone who's in the CIA who's an analyst.
Oh, absolutely.
Because most people think of the CIA as secret agents, but 95% of intelligence is gotten from reading the New York Times, and we're sitting in, and they're doing the same thing you are.
Well, a lot of my students are in as analysts, and I talk to them. Their job is parallel.
So even in the academy, you don't want to dissent from them.
Well,
what's wrong with this? Is this America? No one wants to dissent from anything?
Well, there are some incentives to be the only one. If you say it's green, I want to say it's red, because that will get me attention both in the government and outside. But when everyone says something, they're classical experiments in that in psychology. You put people in a darkened room and a little spot of light, and there's an actual effect in your eyes. You can't tell whether that's moving or not. And if you, an experiment done, what's it, 50, 60 years ago, if you get 4 people and 3 say, oh, it's moving to the right, the other person will say that. You know, we've got lots of these influences, but this is where the politicization is important, and you can't avoid it. And on this thing of where the error is, it's not either or, it's both. That if an analyst...
Okay, let me just stop, see what we're talking about now, because we've talked about the major failure, which everyone talks about. There's some others we can talk about, we'll get to. And I said at the outset of the program, there's 2 strings to this bow. One is what we've been talking about, and then also there's the politicalization of it. In other words, do you blame just the CIA, or do you blame just the politicians, or do you blame both? You want to talk about the politicians. Go ahead. You're a professor of political science. Adlai Stevenson, professor of political science. Of course, it would be better if it was a right-wing professor of political science. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, can't find many of those. Because I think they're involved, they're not separate strands. They interrelate. And there are a lot of the politicization parts I'd love to talk about, but I won't unless we want to go there.
But go ahead.
Well, the one thing is clearly the Bush administration exaggerated what the 3 stages. Look at the intelligence before 9/11 on Iraq. Look at it after 9/11 in the run-up to the war, and look at what the administration said about it. You see a progressive hardening. And the last stage is the pure politicization. That is, in the sense that Bush and Cheney and the others said things, claimed that intelligence was saying things that it wasn't. Anyway, this is the tribute vice pays to virtue. And it's an unfortunate political culture, because you can't get up as a political leader and say, it is my judgment as the elected leader of this country that Saddam is a menace for these reasons. I've talked to intelligence, but I'm not only relying on them. You've elected me, this is my judgment. That's the honest thing to do, but not very politically acceptable. So Bush and Cheney misreported what intelligence was saying. That's not a good thing. But the worst part is, from an intelligence standpoint, is that they knew if they questioned the estimates that really Saddam had fairly big stockpiles, the people from the White House and Defense Department would both excoriate them as just people who had made errors before and were lefties and sabotaged the government, and would ignore them. So conformity was really increased by the political pressures. I think it would have been very hard for someone to say what we now know, which is, hey, you know, chemical weapons of the type Saddam had in '91 deteriorate fast. They don't have a long shelf life. And unless he's been able to develop the higher tech stuff that keeps them around, he can't have a stockpile. The only person I knew who thought this, I didn't, but my colleague, Werner Schilling, very unconventional, independent thinker, pointed this out, and I said, oh, come on, Warner, no one else is saying this, it can't be right. But no, the analysts knew this.
The analysts knew that it was deteriorating.
Well, no, that they knew that unless you had the stabilized stuff, they would deteriorate. So there was reason to question this. But I think one reason they didn't was they knew the political costs of just raising this question would be enormous.
So to speak on behalf of Bush, and wish the audience to know that we tried to get someone else to come on, so we don't want to look like we're tilting against Bush. So let me say in defense of Bush, to repeat a little bit what you said, that he was in a difficult, very difficult position, and the position was a difficult political position, because everyone was saying the same thing. It was very difficult for him. Very difficult for him to dissent, wasn't it? I hadn't thought about that.
It would be hard for any leader to do what you should do. I mean, it's easy for a professor to say what they should do, which is to go to intelligence and say, you know, I think the following. Is there any evidence I'm wrong? Or, you know, I really want you to challenge my beliefs now. Again, professors sometimes say it in the classroom, and sometimes they don't mean it. Political leaders, of course, who have to act quickly, almost never do that. But you really need to have that attitude instilled in the intelligence people. And I've talked to a number of the analysts, and they were, of course, under great if you will, political / psychological pressure.
Let's just talk about the politicalization within the CIA itself of the information it had.
Yeah.
Now, the way this works in terms of Congress voting on something, probably my audience has forgotten this. I had to go back and look it up. But what happened is, roughly speaking, well, I mean, Congress has got to vote to authorize Bush to do this. Congress has to have some record to do it. I mean, it has to be told something. And it was given what is known as a national intelligence estimate.
Yeah.
And Tenet always says estimate, estimate, estimate. It's called the NIE. Now, the estimate is probably still, you should know this, is it still classified?
Yeah, there's a declassified version out there, but the full estimate is still classified because it is based on very sensitive sources. Can you get in there and get that declassified for us?
I'm serious.
No, only Congress could do that. Take a lot of political pressure.
But let me ask you, you've looked at declassification. One thing that occurred to me is, here we've gone to war based on certain information, okay? And some of that information was released in July, some was released last year, some in October at the time of the vote. Well, gee, I'd like to know how my congressperson voted, because how does he look at this information? But yet when you go to figure it out, Congress has got stuff that we don't. Shouldn't that be? I mean, let me ask you. You have. Is the world going to come to an end if they were to let us know exactly what they voted on?
Well, I think they could release more than they do. Yeah. But the people who work on this are not, I think, engaging in self-protection and not, engaged in trying to protect themselves from humiliation. I've been very impressed when we go over arguments and my panel says, why don't you release this, or we look at stuff that isn't being released. I haven't found any case where they're holding stuff back because releasing it would embarrass them, because it would show they were wrong.
They really have a reason to do it.
They worry a lot
on
their sources.
Well, as I said, let's go with the politicalization of the, we call it the NIE. That's the National Intelligence Estimate. For the audience, that's the thing that Congress had in front of it. One of the interesting parts of this estimate, I found going back and looking at it, was the emphasis that's been given to it, and I would say some emphasis in it, on what is known as unmanned aerial vehicles, UAV. Yeah. I did not realize, till I went back and looked at this, that there was a statement in this estimate that effectively said that Iraq is building, what's an unmanned vehicle? Well, that's a drone. Yeah. There's no one in it. It's, it's electronically driven aircraft. And that Iraq had created these aircrafts, and for the purpose, I should say, of putting biological weapons on it, if I may say. Yeah. And in this estimate that's been released to the public, it said that it implied that these UAVs could reach the United States shores. What do you think of that as an intelligence, as a statement made even before? I want to get what Tenet says about. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, on its face, this is wildly implausible. Yeah. I mean, it can reach the American shores if you were able to carry it 2 miles, into New York Harbor. I mean, how? Iraq, last time I looked, my geographer, how many? 6,000, 7,000 miles? I mean, how's it going to get here? Now we can play fancy scenarios. Somehow they get a freighter, they get it out on the deck, they launch it. I mean, come on, this is pretty wild. And the U.S. Air Force, who are the experts on UAVs.
Okay, well, that's the first thing we should say in defense of what's in here. In this national estimate, which anyone who's watching the program, go and get on the net. Just look for the release by Congressman King of Long Island, our Long Island, of the in July of last year of this NIE. And anyone can look at it. Where was my point? I was trying to be fair about it. I was trying to be fair about it because there was this statement. Then the statement that followed it was a statement by the Air Force saying we disagree. Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Congress gets something like that. Yeah. Is that what you should tell Congress? On the one hand, you can reach the shores, but on the other hand, we don't agree. I don't.
Well, I think it's hard, but I think yes.
You do think so?
I think what you want to do with Congress and the executive, you want to lay out the alternatives, where the disagreements are, and what you really want is an annex that says that sort of gives the dialogue that says, why does the Air Force disagree, and what's the CIA or the State Department rebuttal, and then you really want to see that discussion if you're a decision maker.
Right.
I'm afraid that is often hidden even from people in the executive branch. But if you're a decision maker, you should dig that out. The executive and I believe Congress as well.
You know,
but they made no effort.
The Brits did it differently, though, because the Brits took the very same inaccurate, someone is going to think I'm lefty, that I'm against all this, but the truth of the matter is the Brits took some of the evidence which was of not very persuasive nature,
wasn't.
And then they got everybody to agree on a statement. There's some problems with that, but I wonder if initially, isn't that a better way of presenting something to Congress? Congress isn't going to be like a professor at Columbia. Well, on the left hand, on the right hand, he's going to look on the left hand and then say, oh my God, in the case of Trent Lott.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Trent Lott was paid a visit by Cheney, I believe, and Cheney scared him to death. Yeah. Lott, this is what Lott about these unmanned vehicles, about which I really didn't know. I'm very surprised. So I wonder if you say on the left hand by the right hand, it just scares the devil out of anyone, doesn't it?
Well, I think first they do try to reach consensus, and the agencies will bend a little bit because they know if you get too many footnotes, too much dissent, it dilutes the thing. But yeah, I think decision makers are better off facing the uncertainty, and
better off facing the uncertainty.
But the claim on its face was bizarre.
Yeah. Well, now let's go back.
Hardly be.
Now let's go back and look what Tenet says about this.
Yeah, he's still defending it.
He says, I mean, he's got a lot of weasel words on the other parts of the allegations, which means chemical, biological, nuclear. But on unmanned vehicles, he said, we were on target.
Well,
what do you think about that?
I think he's got a problem because the administration is still touting UAVs, and he can't. On the one hand, he's independent, but he can't open up too much daylight. I think it's a very delicate job. He's got not two hands, but three hands. On the one hand, he's got to be as honest as he can be. On the other hand, he can't open up too much gap between him and the administration.
Why not?
Well,
I mean, politically, he just can't.
Yeah,
forget the idealism.
He is a presidential, appointee. Yeah. He's the only one in the government whose job is to tell the truth. I mean, I don't mean the other people's job to lie.
Is this the truth?
And it's the agency over the headquarters, over the doorway. Yeah. They have the biblical quote, ye shall seek the truth and it shall set ye free.
Is that at the CIA?
Yes, it is. And it's the only government agency that could, well, aside for a few scientific agencies, that could even claim that. And I don't mean the others are out there to lie. I mean they're out there to make and implement policy. Right. And so he's got the job of trying to lay out the information and the inferences in a way that's divorced from policy. But you can't completely do that.
Well, how do you think
so that's one dilemma. The other dilemma is he's got a big staff back there who have taken an incredible battering. And part of the speech is cheerleading. Part of it is saying, we were not all wrong, and look at the good things we've done. And actually, some of what he says here and some of which he could have said, there are a lot of things that the CIA did get right. CIA intelligence was very important in convincing Gaddafi and Libya to give up that program. Was important for rolling up finally the AQ-Khan network of selling nuclear material out of Pakistan.
Those are big triumphs. The one with respect to Gaddafi apparently was achieved through an interception, as I read it in the newspaper, of a delivery of equipment to Gaddafi on a ship that was picked up in Saudi Arabia or somewhere. There's no question CIA's had some great triumphs, but tonight's show show is does Tenet have it right? How about
he doesn't. But part of his job is boosting the morale of his people who are under fire. That's, I think, part of why the speech, when you and I read it, it doesn't clear the air the way that I would like.
we have to be realistic about this. He can't dissemble too much in public, is what you're saying. Let me ask about the biological weapons, if I can. The biological weapons proof was based on statements that Powell made to the UN and which were in this National Intelligence Estimate relating to vans.
Yeah.
And these vans were supposed to be used for making biological weapons, I think it's fair to say.
Oh, yes.
And the two of the weapons were captured, and there was a disagreement as to whether they're made for used for making oxygen or for making biological weapons. Then it turns out, on top of that, that one of the sources, there are 3 or 4 sources for this information, turned out to be a Chalabi being the person who's the head of the governing council, a member of the governing council in Iraq, and emigre who really wanted to go back into Iraq. And this person, who was a Chalabi person, lied to the CIA about the purpose of these vans. Now, everyone knows that. Do you think that the head of the CIA should own up to that in a speech like this? How do you deal with that? Is he just can't deal with it? It's politically impossible?
Politically very difficult, because the whole problem of the Chalabi network is a very important piece of the whole picture. Once the UN inspectors were kicked out in '98, that between that time and the time the new UN group went back after the November resolution, we lost our main source of information, and so we were relying heavily on overhead photography. Didn't tell you a lot, and then the agents, the human reports, so-called HUMINT, we were getting largely came through Chalabi's organization, the Iraqi National Congress, and they were, of course, dedicated to what happened, an American intervention to overthrow Saddam. So all that information was tainted, and the analysts had 2 problems. One is you're dealing with information coming from people who are biased, but you can't just throw it out. It might be right, although biased. The second problem, again, the link to politicization, is that Cheney, especially in Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz, were touting this information.
We have to come to an end.
And so but yeah, he should have come clean.
He should have come clean. Well, I guess we know the answer to the question, but I have to ask you, did he get it right?
No, he didn't.
Thanks a lot for coming by, Bob.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Good discussion.
And thank you very much for coming by. Please come back next week to learn more about the digital age. For the digital age, I am James Goodale. Good night.